Hello everyone, this is Professor Hasselman and this is History 104, and today we're going to talk a little bit more about ancient Greece. And now, one of the things before we start talking about this, we've already talked a little bit about Athens and Sparta and Greek democracy. But one of the things we need to talk about in this section is what history really is. So, Voltaire said that history was lies the living told about the dead. Henry Ford said it was bunk. The Greeks invented it. And what did they think it was? Greeks did not invent historical mindedness, and this we see among Mesopotamians, Egyptians, and vividly among the Hebrews. And for the Hebrews, history was a way of revealing the unfolding relationship between God and his chosen people. Now, in a richly paradoxical sense, history was also prophetic for the Hebrews. The past pointed to the future, and that was true for the Greeks, but also without the religious component. Now, the Greeks invented history as a specific literary art. But Aristotle, who knew a bit about literary art, said that poets would never lie, but historians usually did. He meant basically that poets capture real motivations while historians haggle over mere details. The greatest Greek historian wrote down many details, but they also developed large themes about human life and conduct, themes that they believed to be universally valid. The Greek histories, thus, have an epic quality about them. Now, Herodotus, who lived around 485 to 425 BCE, is the father of history, if you will, the father of history. He wrote a long, highly entertaining account of the Persian Wars, which he saw as the watershed moment in Greek history. Born in Ionia of a good family, Herodotus was widely read, and he quotes Homer and Hesiod, and voraciously curious. He traveled all over the Greek world, to Egypt, through central Mesopotamia, and in the northern Balkans, and he constantly interviewed people. He placed primary reliance on what he had seen with his own eyes, but he also collated what he had heard. Now, why did he write? He was fascinated by how the Greeks were able to defeat the Persians. To get an answer, he decided that he needed to know all he could about the Persians, about the lands conquered by the Persians, and how exactly the war had begun. For Herodotus, historiae meant researches or investigations. He took something of a dramatist's view of his task. There were underlying causes for historical events, but also immediate triggers. Now, in the case of the Persian Wars, Herodotus believed that the attack by Croesus of Lydia on the Persians was the proximate cause because it brought the Persians into Anatolia, then into Ionia. But the longer terms of underlying cause was the arrogance of great states coupled with a certain inevitability in the clash between East and West, the struggle between slaves and freemen as he saw it. Thucydides, who lived around 460 to 555 BCE, knew and admired the work of Herodotus. He even borrowed from it, but he puts the writing of history on a new path. Whereas Herodotus wrote about the Persian Wars, Thucydides wrote of the Peloponnesian Wars. This was the great contest between Athens and Sparta, who we mentioned in the previous lecture, between the Peloponnesian League, led by Athens, and led by Sparta, and the Athenian Empire, centered of course at Athens, which in this war lasted from about 432 to 401 BCE, but had begun brewing in the 450s BCE. His account stops abruptly in 411. So again, he's writing about the Peloponnesian War, a war between Sparta and Athens. Now, although Thucydides' work is incomplete and unrevised, enough survives to reveal his working methods and his overall views and intentions. He viewed the causes as Sparta's inordinate fear of Athens, stirred up by some of Sparta's allies. He's cautious about Athens' rise to greatness, but thinks the glory of the Periclean age was worth the cost of empire and the danger of war. Pericles' funeral oration is Thucydides' great statement about Athens. Yet, war itself can cause a society such stress as to make its savage character emerge, to change the quality and character of its leaders. His account of the Mytilene affair reveals his thinking. Thucydides, of course, was subject to many influences of his time. Like Herodotus, he was influenced by the dramatists, even down to his use of archaic poetic language. The medical writers taught him something about the etiology, progress, and diagnosis of political and social problems. Sophists, more about them coming up, taught him about rhetoric, the power of language, the influence of people, and about the problems surrounding ideas of absolute truth and justice. The Melian dialogue is his famous treatment of this very theme. Xenophon, who lived from about 428 or 27 to 354 BCE, carried on the history of Thucydides and wrote independent works. Now, historical writing has been a key feature of Western culture since the Greeks, partly to preserve accounts of great deeds, partly to teach one's own generation lessons, and partly to fashion and shape how later generations will see things. Now, the Greeks, aside from inventing history, also invented philosophy as a particular formal intellectual discipline. Philosophy is a Greek word, as is philosopher. It appeared about 400 BCE. Conventionally, the history of Greek philosophy is divided at the person of Socrates, who lived from about 469 to 399 BCE. In this part of this lecture, we will consider the pre-Socratics, and the Greeks were not the first to marvel at the world around them or to accumulate large amounts of practical information. Now, people asked why everything or anything exists. Early Greek poets had done this and had provided cosmological answers. On reflection, it was seen that all peoples attributed the coming into being of the world to various religious beings. Their answers were contradictory and conflicted with experience. People also asked how things worked. Now, this might lead to an inquiry into first principles or might remain at the level of applied knowledge. Greeks began to inquire into the nature of things that exist all around us, and into the process whereby they had come into being and by which they changed. Consider, for example, a seed that is planted, grows, bears fruit, dies, withers, and then decays. What's going on here? The Greeks also saw that explanations about how the world out there worked demanded some hard thinking about the process of knowing and the means of communicating knowledge. Now, three questions may be said to lie at the base of Greek and subsequent philosophy. What is the world made of? How can we know? And what should we do? The quest for wisdom, according to Aristotle, student of Socrates, and to most modern commentators, began in Ionia. This was a land open to Persia, and through the Persians, the Mesopotamian knowledge. The people there were familiar, too, with the Greek world and literature. Around 600 BCE, Thales of Miletus began to think about what exists and how it came into being. He decided on water as a primordial element. It's not clear if he thought that everything started as water and turned into other things, or if everything we can see is somehow composed of water. Some of Thales' successors posed other materialistic answers to the question, what is the world made of? Namely, earth, air, fire, and water. Parmenides said that being is one, motionless, uniform, and eternal. In this view, change was illusory, which was a response to Heraclitus' idea that change was itself, so to speak, the one immutable thing. But Anaxagoras responded that the mind was critical. Things existed to the degree, and only to the degree, that they were perceived. By the middle of the 5th century BCE, Greek thinkers on being had been put on the path it would follow thereafter. Now, as thinkers reflected on being, they began to turn to the problem of knowledge. Now, we may capture this issue with 4 questions. What does it mean to know? Can we really know anything? What means are available to us for knowing? And how is the world constituted? And how am I constituted so that I can know something about the world? Now, initially, knowledge was equated with what I have seen and what I have experienced myself. Think of Herodotus and his eyewitnesses reporting or of the diagnostics of the medical writers, writing about what they saw. Soon this extended to other senses, hearing, smelling, tasting, and even touch itself. But sense perception as a basis for knowledge evoked severe criticism. Senses are unreliable to the extent that they are subjective. There is the problem of hearsay or second-hand knowledge. I know something because I told you, or someone told me. With the critique of senses came a critique of language. Is language really capable of capturing and communicating reality? One way out of the impasse was offered by Pythagoras. Pythagoras, who lived around the late 6th century BCE, formed a mystical brotherhood in southern Italy. His philosophy was based on the idea that wisdom came only from a life wholly dedicated to intense thought. Pythagoras somehow came upon the mathematical relationships between the musical intervals, and perhaps the Pythagorean theorem too, although one of his disciples may have discovered this. This suggested, like Anaxagoras' concept of mind, that material answers were insufficient and that human reason might discover and reliably communicate law-like propositions that pertain to reality and to the world as it actually is. So instead of relying solely on our senses, we may have to rely on what we see and how we interpret exactly what we see and what we experience. And then all these universal laws will come into play. Now, after some Greeks had spent a century and a half thinking about reality and knowledge, the Sophists turned to the practical matters of ethics. How should we behave? So first is how should we feel? What are our emotions and our senses? How should we learn or know? And now how should we behave? Sophists and sophistry had a bad name, not without some justification. Sophists were typically wandering teachers who, for a fee, sometimes an exorbitant fee, would teach people the artful use of language. And this was important in Athenian assemblies and law courts. This art was so much taken for granted that Thucydides larded his history with speeches. Aristophanes pilloried the sophists in his comedies. Sophistic ethics were based on a few fundamental propositions. A distinction was made between nomos, or law and convention, and physis, nature, the natural order of things. So nomos, N-O-M-O-S, and physis, P-H-Y-S-I-S. The Sophists held that because society's rules were not eternal, not imprescriptibly right, and not universal, they were matters of convention, and people could change them if they wished, or flaunt them if they could. Man is the measure of all things, said Protagoras. The aim is to prevail, not to be right. Gorgias posed the hermeneutic paradox. Nothing exists. If anything existed, I could not know about it. Even if I could know about it, I could not communicate my knowledge. At this juncture, Socrates appeared, desiring to vindicate reality, knowledge, and absolute truth. But the Sophists had left their mark indelibly, as in Thucydides, Sophocles, and Euripides, and Aristophanes, as already mentioned. In 399, when Socrates was put to death, the future of the now 200-year-old Greek philosophical heritage was an open question. Now to wrap up this discussion on Greek writing and philosophy, we're going to turn now to Plato and Aristotle. Socrates was smug, pompous, cantankerous, and brilliant. An Athenian jury condemned him to death for corrupting the young. His death disillusioned many of his followers, but caused one of them, Plato, to dedicate himself to defending the master's teachings. Socrates wrote nothing, and almost all we know, or think we know, come from Plato's dialogues. Plato clearly defended much of his teacher's thought, but gradually Plato's thought became his own. The starting point was that there is something out there that we can know, that we have the tools to apprehend that something, and that having apprehended that something, we can reliably communicate it to others. So again, the starting point was that there's something out there that we can know, something out there that we can learn and know, that we have the tools within us to apprehend that something, or to comprehend and or to grab that thing inside of us, and that after we have that in our minds and we've apprehended that, we can communicate about it with others. Now, Plato was a consummate stylist, an influential teacher, and a wide-ranging thinker. He came from a wealthy and influential family and traveled widely. He devoted his adult life to philosophy, founding his school, the Academy, around 385 BCE. To begin with, let's review the problems. Change appears to be constant, and stability elusive. The senses are flawed tools of perception. Language has severe limitations as a tool of communication, and laws are human contrivances, not eternal regulations. So these are the problems that Plato had to constantly go through and battle with as he was coming up with new ideas and new philosophies. Now, Plato addressed himself to two big questions. What is the nature of knowledge, and what means do we have of obtaining and holding it? And two, what is morality, and what is the best form of human life? Plato was a prolific writer. His earliest works were in dialogue, form, and perhaps because this accorded with Socrates' teaching methods. Gradually, the works became straightforward treatises, or essays. At least three things are controversial about Plato's thought. How much of Plato is attributable to Socrates? Did he use the Socratic anunkus and essentially demonstrate what was wrong with other views, or did he advance positive doctrines of his own? And did he have a coherent system of thought, or is Platonism attributable to his commentators? Now, in general terms, we can understand Plato's theories of knowledge and morality in his Republic. Plato said, "We are accustomed to posit some one form concerning each set of things to which we apply the same name. The form, according to Plato, is the very thing to which the name is applied. The form is invisible and is grasped by thought, not by the senses. Its relation to the named thing is as original to copy. Such knowledge as we have of the form is true knowledge, and all else is mere opinion." In The Myth of the Cave, from the Republic, Plato came to close as close as he ever did to making clear what he meant. We can, for purposes of discussion, take two examples, a concrete one, a shoe, and an abstract one, love. Plato speaks of an immortal soul, and this is eternal and has knowledge of the eternal, transcendent realm that it communicates to each sentient being. Also, in his Republic, Plato reflected on the human soul before it is imprisoned in the body, or on the embodied soul, and on the kind of state that properly arrayed souls could create. The soul has appetites, courage, and reason. Virtue, which equates to knowledge, is a proper arrangement of these three. An ideal polity, therefore, would have farmers with all desirable possessions, soldiers without property or family, like in Sparta perhaps, and philosophers who had such elevated understanding that they felt a duty, not a desire to rule, and whose desires did not attach to material things. So let's turn to Aristotle. So Aristotle, who lived around 384 to 322 BCE, came from the far north of the Greek world. His father was a doctor and had ties to the Macedonian court. At 17, Aristotle entered the academy, and he spent some time as tutor to Alexander the Great and lived in Ionia for a while after Plato's death. In 335, he founded his Lyceum in Athens. Aristotle learned much from his master, and the differences between them should not be exaggerated. Aristotle was a prolific writer, but also a rigorously systematic one. Marked by what one scholar called inspired common sense, Aristotle based his ideas on observation and close study, not on pure thought. His earliest work was in zoology, and his most durable in biology. Perhaps we see here the influence of his doctor father. But we can also see the long reach of the Ionians, beginning with Thales. Aristotle did not see change as illusory or as a proof of the contradictory nature of change. The fact that an acorn became an oak tree, for example, did not prove somehow that being became non-being, or that being came from non-being. Change, according to Aristotle, is a natural process that can be explained. Alternatively, there is actually no such thing as change. Forms do not have existence separate from the things by which they are named. Reality is in the specific and observable. Now, Aristotle had a profound love of order. He classified all sciences, that is, branches of knowledge, as theoretical, those that aim at knowledge, practical, those that aim to improve conduct, and productive, those that aim at making beautiful, useful things. So again, there were theoretical sciences, according to Plato, to Aristotle, practical sciences, and productive sciences. He wrote on specific disciplines such as logic, rhetoric, poetics, and politics, and he believed that the communication of what is known or knowable depends on careful description. Hence, his categories: substance, quantity, quality, relation, location, time, position, condition, action, and affection. Aristotle also laid down rules for syllogisms as a way of testing propositions, which in turn helped him to discuss both knowledge and communication. He classified 256 kinds of syllogisms, with only 24 of them valid. Thinkers had long understood that knowledge of being depended on causation, how things came to be. Pierre Péregrin describes Aristotelian causation theory this way: there are 4 ways in which something is said to be responsible for something else. In one sense, the responsible element in the statue is the bronze from which it is made. In another sense, a certain numerical relation is responsible for the octave, or the sound in music. In still another sense, the one who has promulgated a decree is responsible for it. And finally, the health I would like to recover is responsible for the fact that I waste my time at sports. There are 4 causes at work in nature. Taken in the order of the above example, or the mentioned examples, these are the material, the formal, the efficient, and the final. The concepts of essence and accident, act and power, provide for his way of assessing being and non-change. Ethics for Aristotle were habits that could be inculcated by careful training from earliest youth. The goal of life is happiness, which Aristotle equated with virtue. Man's goal, which means to gain knowledge, obviously in this sense. Man's goal is to be happy, not to know what happiness is. The virtue of the shoemaker is not to understand the concept or shoe, but to be able to make the shoe. And true happiness is achieved by moderation and self-control. But every person is different, and some are more high-minded. Now, the famous Renaissance painter Raphael's famous painting, The School of Athens, has Plato and Aristotle walking side by side. Plato points upward. Truth, reality, and knowledge of them are not here. Now we have only vague hints of impressions. Aristotle points down, or perhaps right in front of himself. Truth, reality, and knowledge of them are right here in this world. But we must study attentively and reason correctly. Plato and Aristotle build on the foundations of Greek thought before them, so Western thought ever since has been built on these two pillars. So this is the end of Greek history writing and Greek philosophy. I hope you enjoyed today's lecture. This is Professor Hasselman, History 104. Have a wonderful day, and I look forward to talking to you in the next lecture.